Okay. I understand that last night John Kenneth Galbraith said that the North American Free Trade Agreement would not have any noticeable or significant impact on life in the United States or on our economy. And I guess I'm here today to alert you to the fact that, as arrogant as it may sound, that he's wrong about that. And I want to start by saying that it's important to understand the North American Free Trade Agreement as the culmination of a process and not the beginning of a process. And I'm going to go through a lot of what I think this process is, but I want to alert you to the realities of continental economic integration by presenting you with two pertinent facts. The first is that last year, Americans bought more salsa than ketchup for the first time in history. And this year, as I'm sure you noticed recently, a Canadian team, Toronto, won the so-called World Series. So we're clearly in the era of North American economic integration. Now, I know it's true that the salsa that's sold in the United States was mostly made in Texas, or even Vermont for that matter, and that the Toronto team is really made up of Yankees and Cubans, but nonetheless, you can get a sense that we're definitely moving into a new era. Why is this happening, and why has the process that has given rise to this experiment in market integration on a continental basis, why is this happening? Well, it's no secret that the United States economy and American business in general has been in some trouble for quite a while. There's been a sort of 20, 25-year, depending on how you measure it, kind of crisis of profitability on the one hand, and perhaps more pertinent to the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, I'm going to call it NAFTA for short if you don't mind, it's too many syllables otherwise, has been the decline of U.S. business in the world market in general. One measure of this decline, and I believe the one that's actually least important, is the U.S. share of world trade, which declined from 16% in 1966 to about 14% in 1986, probably a little bit less than that now. One of the reasons I don't believe that's the main thing that this is all about is that if you look at the share of world trade held by U.S. corporations, not by the U.S. economy, but by U.S. corporations operating on a worldwide basis, you'll see that in fact it held up throughout this whole period and stayed pretty stable at 17 or 18% of the world market. But there were declines in other important indicators. So for example, the U.S. share of world manufacturing declined from 35% in 1970 of all world manufacturing to 25% at the end of the 1980s. That's a pretty substantial decline. If you look at the figures for foreign direct investment, that is all the money that all countries invest in each other, not in themselves, but in each other abroad, it's even more dramatic. First of all, 24 countries in the world control 98% of all the foreign direct investment. Of those countries, 5 control 75% of that 98%. I'll let you guess which the 5 are. I'm sure you've come up with more or less the right answers. Now, of that 75%, of those 5 nations that control that majority of all the foreign investment in the world, the United States controlled 69% in the period 1961 through 68. But by the decade of the 80s, it was down to 28%, with Germany and Japan, and to a lesser extent Great Britain, taking up the rest of it. In other words, these 5 countries continued to control the vast majority of foreign investment in the world, but within them there was a shift of wealth away from the United States. So U.S. corporations have been looking for a response to this loss of position in world production, in world investment, and to a lesser extent in world trade. The first response they came up with, I'm going to talk about here as a strategy or a model of accumulation. That is a strategy of production in order to allow U.S. manufacturing in particular to reconquer some of its lost competitive position on a world scale. The model that I'm talking about, I'm going to call the lean production / management by stress model. I won't repeat the whole title every time. And I'll explain to you why I'm calling it this. Lean production is the MIT Automotive Group's name for Toyotaism, if you will. That is the style of production pioneered and developed by the Toyota company in particular, and to a lesser extent by other Japanese manufacturing firms. Management by stress refers to the fact that an important aspect of this system of production is to constantly stress it out, to constantly stretch it to its limits in order to find out the weaknesses in it and thereby to strengthen it. The management by stress term was coined by Jane Slaughter and Mike Parker, who work with me at Labor Notes and who have written a couple of books and many articles on this subject. So I'm combining these two ideas, the idea of lean production and the idea of management by stress. The characteristics of this system are basically as follows. First of all, traditional production, let's say Fordist-style production or mass production, is decentralized through a system of elaborated outsourcing and subcontracting. That is, there are many tiers in the manufacturing system. As much of the burden is put on subcontractors as is possible by the final assembly corporation. And of course, the purpose of this is that the wage levels, the costs of production and so forth are supposed to go lower as you go down the subcontracting ladder. And one of the ways that's done is to outsource or subcontract to lower wage regions of the world or lower wage countries. And it's partly on the basis of that kind of thing that the economic blocs that you probably read about a lot, that is the European community, the North American free trade area, and increasingly Eastern Asia are sort of taking shape around this kind of a production system. The second aspect of this production system is the flexible workplace and the concept of Kaizen, which is constant improvement. It's what I was talking about before, the management by stress aspect of this thing, whereby you are constantly trying to find the flaws in the system and improve it, make it more productive, and hence more profitable. And a third aspect, and there are others, but I'm going to talk about these three, is the just-in-time delivery and inventory system, which allows the assembly corporation to hold on to as few components and parts as possible, saving it money in a number of ways. Now, between the first aspect, decentralized production strung out particularly across national borders, and this last one, just-in-time, there's a kind of tension, a kind of contradiction. Obviously, in just-in-time delivery, you need a certain geographic proximity. And at the same time, though, if you're looking for lower wage regions, you need some kind of geographic spread. So, in fact, even in the Japanese practice, even in the Toyota company corporation, there has been a modification of just-in-time, and I suppose you could call it almost in time, but I'm not going to. That has taken place as this production system becomes internationalized for the purpose of cutting costs. That's what it's all about, cutting costs. And that is, in a real sense, what the NAFTA is about. The name of this agreement, free trade agreement, is in a big sense a misnomer in two ways. One is that it's not primarily about trade at all. It's about investment and this production system, primarily. And second of all, and I'll get to this in a couple of minutes, it's not about what we think of as free trade in the traditional economic sense, that is arm's length commerce between nations, and I'll explain why in a minute, that its intention was primarily about investment and about production strategies was kind of revealed in one of the documents from the U.S. International Trade Commission that came out in 1991, their analysis of this thing, wherein they say, by codifying liberal trade and investment policies in an international agreement, a U.S.-Mexico free trade agreement would increase the confidence of investors in the Mexican economy. This is an important thing to remember because from the point of view of United States capital, the corporations in this country, investing in any place in the third world has certain kinds of problems, and they want some guarantee that their investments are going to be protected, which in fact the NAFTA does. I mean, even if the agreement were abrogated the day after it was signed by Canada or Mexico or the United States, any investments made under it would be guaranteed for 10 years, which is quite a deal. Another angle on it, more recent one, comes from DRI McGraw-Hill in their survey and analysis of the actual document itself, in which they say they expect the major impact of the agreement to occur on investment flows, at least in the short run, while significant stimulus to trade flows will occur only over a longer period of time. And why is that? And that gets back to what I was talking about why this is more about investment than trade. What this simple sentence actually says here is that the trade they're talking about is investment-induced trade. And most of this kind of trade is what economists call intra-firm trade. That is trade that takes place within the channels of the multinational corporations. So in a very real sense, it's not free trade. It's not arm's length trade. It's free in the sense that it won't be burdened by the kinds of tariffs and so forth that used to exist between the United States and Mexico, and they've been undoing for the past 10 years, actually. In that sense, it's free trade. But it is trade that is regulated, very definitely regulated and planned by the corporations. And again, a little bit later, when I talk about linkages, we'll see how important that is. All right. The low-wage nature of this inter-firm trade, getting back to this notion of decentralized production, is important too. And again, looking back at the government documents before this agreement was finished, in this case, the 1991 Economic Report of the President, they have this little sentence in which some of these documents are so ideologically loaded, it's quite amazing. This one, you might recognize a version of the theory of comparative advantage in here if you've studied economics. It says, to reduce costs, companies often allocate phases of the manufacturing process among a number of nations. A free trade agreement with Mexico would further encourage this natural division of labor, that's the comparative advantage idea, by lowering the overall cost of U.S. manufacturing firms. A free trade agreement would make U.S. firms more competitive against other countries' exports in the world market. In other words, the whole idea here is that supposedly there's some kind of natural division of labor between the United States and Mexico, in which the natural position of Mexico is to be poor, and our natural position is to not be poor, and therefore we're going to make U.S. corporations competitive essentially by stringing production across the U.S.-Mexican border and using low-wage Mexican labor. All right. There was a problem that they ran into. This idea, by the way, has been around for a long time, of having a North American free trade agreement. It came up in the late 70s. They've actually been negotiating at it since the mid-80s. But there was a problem from the vantage point of the U.S. corporations and of U.S. business. And this was the nature of the Mexican economy. Mexico's economy, until very recently, was very much a state-led economy, although it was very definitely a capitalist market system in its most basic sense. It was a highly regulated and controlled market system. It was, in fact, a kind of successful example of what is called import substitution industrialization. And that means a sort of guided industrialization process. And Mexico was one of a number of countries in the Third World and Latin America in particular that pursued a pretty successful version of this. Annual growth in Mexico from 1940 through the late 70s was 6%. And in terms of industry, annual growth averaged 7.6% for that whole period, which is much higher than anything the United States accomplished in the same period. But from the vantage point of the United States, this was not a good deal because in order to do that kind of growth, that kind of import substitution, industrialization, Mexico's economy was a highly protected economy. There were not, imports were taxed at very high tariff rates. Many of them were excluded altogether. And foreign investment in Mexico was allowed, even encouraged, but was conducted under the rules laid down by the Mexican government itself. That is, for example, with certain notable exceptions, it was not allowed to have a foreign corporation own a majority ownership of a company in Mexico. Now, all of that has changed already, even before the agreement is signed and ratified. But so the economy was a highly regulated economy. And of course, as you know, in our own country, we've gone through this process of deregulation for the past 10 years or more, in fact more. Well, in Mexico, they had to go through a more drastic version of it. How did this happen? Well, in 1982, as you may know, Mexico declared itself unable to make the payments on its national debt, on its international debt, rather, its foreign debt. Like most nations of Latin America and many in the Third World, Mexico had pursued its industrialization by borrowing heavily during a period when interest rates were relatively low. It was a strategy that made perfect sense at the time, but when interest rates went high, it no longer made sense, and Mexico, like many other countries, including the United States, it must be said, ended up in debt, and at a certain point was unable to meet this debt. In 1982, when it declared this, it initiated what Mexicans call la crisis, obviously the crisis, and that refers to more than the debt crisis. It refers to the fact that at that point, the International Monetary Fund intervened, and with the cooperation of the Mexican government, the administration of Miguel de la Madrid, and after that, the Salinas administration, implemented an austere structural adjustment program that changed the whole nature of the Mexican economy drastically in a period of 10 years. What did they do? The first sort of central element of this austerity program brought in by the International Monetary Fund was privatization. Mexico possessed at that time over 1,100 state enterprises, ranging from oil to its telephone, airlines, a lot of other kinds of industrial production and mining and so forth. The IMF said, no, we have to get rid of these state enterprises and sell them basically to the private sector. Unlike Eastern Europe, Mexico does possess a wealthy capitalist class that was able to participate in the buying up of these, along with foreign capital. 37 families were able to buy the equivalent of 80% of the value of all the privatizations, so that there's still an enormous concentration of economic power, only it's gone from the government to private hands now. By 1991, 822 of these 1,100 state corporations had been sold. Another 130 or something like that have been in process since that time. And the only major thing that wasn't sold was Pemex, the national oil company. The second aspect of this was deregulation in the American sense. That is, there are all kinds of industries in Mexico, just as there were here, that were not state-owned but were highly regulated, transportation, trucking, things of this sort. 25 of these industries were deregulated during the 1980s under the IMF program. Again, in one of these sort of ideologically loaded statements of approval, the U.S. International Trade Commission remarked on this. Based on the premise that excessive and obsolete regulations were largely responsible for inefficiency in the use of Mexican resources, Mexico has implemented a far-reaching program of deregulation. And indeed they have. To this IMF program, the administrations of the Mexican government, in particular the administration of Carlos Salinas, added their own important twists. And some of these are important to understand because to try to understand the North American Free Trade Agreement without understanding the changes that are going on in all of the economies, and I'm going to talk about Canada and the United States in a minute, is to misunderstand the whole purpose of this thing or what it's going to do to us in the long run. The two major changes that were implemented at this time were changes, most recently actually, in Article 123 of the Constitution, which governs labor relations. Now these are actually still in the making, but the basic purpose of these changes is to make it even more difficult for trade unions in Mexico to function as independent representatives of the workers in the industries down there. Most of the unions are governed by people who are part of the governing institutional revolutionary party, so that there's a kind of state connection with the leadership of the unions, but there are also independent unions. The new laws and amendments to the Constitution are meant to, to do what's been done here, let's put it frankly, that is to make it harder for unions to strike and so forth. But even more important than that one is the change in Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution. Article 27 is, in a certain sense, the centerpiece of the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920. This is the part of the Constitution that didn't guarantee, but made available to the peasantry of Mexico land grants of basically small-sized farms that were where the ownership was guaranteed forever, basically. They could not be sold or alienated or taken back by banks or anything of that sort. So that under this program, something like 3 to 4 million families came to live on land that was granted them by the government in a land reform program that goes back all the way to the Revolution, but actually got its biggest boost in the 1930s and 40s. And this system was backed up by a system of low interest credit that was available to these small farms, which are called ejidos, and allowed a large part of the Mexican population to live on the land to produce, not only for themselves, but to produce a surplus for the economy as a whole as well, for many, many years. This has all been undone in two ways. Changing the Constitution was one way. That was done earlier this year. What was done was to change the section in the Constitution that says this land cannot be sold or rented. Now it can be rented, and I believe even sold under certain circumstances. And to make sure that this does happen, the government put in over $5 billion of loans, not to the farmers, but to businesses to get into joint ventures with these small farmers. Well, what that means is agribusiness, largely American agribusiness, will begin buying up this land, and 3 to 4 million families will be moving off the land because they can't get credit to produce efficiently, and they will not be able to compete with, for example, corn from Iowa. It's the good news for Iowa, it's bad news for Mexican farmers. So this enormous change means that sometime in the next several years, an estimated 10 to 15 million people will leave the land and enter the labor force in Mexico. Keep that figure in your mind for a little while, 10 to 15 million. All right. What were the results of this whole structural adjustment program and of the changes implemented by the Mexican government itself? Well, there are no precise figures, but there are estimates for certain periods. For example, the privatizations up to 1988 were said to have cost, either through liquidation or consolidations, 200,000 jobs. The reorganization of Pemex, the state oil company, will cost 60 to 80,000 jobs. The restructuring of the private sector of the Mexican economy cost, again, up to about 1988, 700,000 jobs, and there have been quite a few changes since then, which means that we're talking about a loss here, a deduction of about 1 million waged jobs, jobs in the formal sector of the economy that took place under this IMF-led program, okay? Another result of this, another result of this is the growth of the informal sector. Obviously, if you have a shrinking of the formal sector, you're going to have a growth of the informal sector. Informal sector is a polite economist term for underground economy, or all the people, you see selling chiclets and other things on the streets in most third world countries in Latin America and in Mexico as well, on an increasing number. People who do homework, family, unpaid work, all that kind of thing, who don't receive a paid wage and who are therefore not part of the Social Security system in Mexico too, which is something I'm not even going to talk about, but that's also being undone under this plan. Now, okay, in that period, you also had a certain industrial growth. In the north of Mexico, which I'm going to return to in a minute, you had a gain of about 400,000 jobs under the border industrialization program, or what's commonly called the Maquiladora program. But if you think about 400,000 jobs gained versus 1 million lost, this is not a real good deal. All right, what's the impact of all of this process that's been going on there, and of the general shift in investment that has been going on as a result of that process? Most of this investment, though not all of it, going into the Maquiladora program. Well, let's look at Canada just for a second. They've had a free trade agreement with the United States since the beginning of 1989. In the first 2 years of that program, it was recorded that 435,000 manufacturing jobs were lost. That's 22% of the total in all of Canada. Now it will be objected this took place during a recession, and so it did. Absolutely true. But unlike what had happened in the 1980, 81, 82 recession, this time fully half of these jobs were lost due to permanent plant closings. And what happened to those plants? They went to low-wage areas, notorious low-wage areas like Buffalo, New York, Detroit, Michigan, places like that. Now, if we can look at that and see what's been happening, then let's return to the United States for a minute and look what's been going on here as there has been this investment shift. It's already going on. Remember, the NAFTA isn't something that's going to create this. The NAFTA is meant to encode this in international law. It's already going on. Just taking one period, 1986 to 89, we can see in the U.S. Rust Belt, that is basically the Midwest and the Northeast, 300,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in that period. Coincidentally, 250,000 new Maquiladora jobs were created at the same time. Now, I'm not saying that each of these is a one-for-one trade-off or something like that. It doesn't work quite that simply, but there is somewhat of a correlation. The U.S. auto parts industry, for example, in that same period lost 85,000 jobs, while auto maquila jobs grew by about 80,000. So there is something going on here. Moving into the 89-92 period, where we have a recession, but where Business Week and everybody else is admitting there's something more going on here than a business cycle, there is a fundamental restructuring, and indeed, the magazine Workplace Trends out of Cleveland estimates that 1,400 jobs have been lost each business day during the period 89 through the middle of 92 as a result of corporate reorganizations and restructurings. So this shift of investment that we're talking about has enormous consequences for much of the United States. There's another thing about this investment, by the way. And that is, often when people who are in favor of the free trade agreement talk about it, they talk about all this investment as new investment. Well, in one sense it's new, it wasn't where it is before, but in a real sense, most of this investment is nothing but a lateral move. That is, if you close down something in Michigan or Iowa and you open it somewhere else, you don't have a net gain, or at least not very much of a net gain in real investment there. So there is that character to this thing as well. Some of the studies that have been done project no job loss, and some of the studies that have been done project big job loss for the next 10 years. The ITC study, the International Trade Commission, says, don't worry, no big job loss here. And the reason it can say that are basically two things. One is that that study is based solely on trade flows and doesn't take into consideration investment shift. And the second is it's based on a model of general equilibrium which assumes full employment everywhere. Well, there isn't full employment everywhere. It's a ridiculous assumption. The more critical studies, I'm going to mention two, one done at the University of Massachusetts and one done by the Washington-based Economic Policy Institute, estimate job loss anywhere in the U.S. from 290,000 to 550,000. These are only manufacturing jobs. And I think all of these studies underestimate the impact considerably because they don't take into consideration the service sector. Now we think the service sector, you can't export service jobs. Wrong, you can. One of the things that will happen that will create net investment in Mexico, and is already going on, and is probably something that needed to be done, is the modernization of much of the business infrastructure down there. The telephone system, having been privatized and now partly controlled by Southwestern Bell, a U.S. company, is proceeding to modernize that whole system. So there's some investment there. That's going to cost about 10,000 jobs, of course, but it is modernization. There are other kinds. They're going to modernize the financial system. Modernize is another word for American financial institutions going to go in there and play a very big role, and already are, in putting in place a lot of the investment that we're talking about. So there are going to be, there's going to be somewhat of a shift in financial services and telecommunication services and data processing. The reason that this might, and I can't predict with total accuracy if it will, but might cause a net job loss in the United States has to do with the technology of these particular service industries. That is, all of them are based to a large extent on telecommunications technology, the transmission of data and so forth, which is why they have to modernize Telmex. But the flows of this information don't have to necessarily go through any facility in the United States. We, Labor Notes, where I work, we sponsored a tour of some Mexican telephone workers in the United States and Canada last year. And while they were in Toronto, a Bell Canada supervisor told them that Toronto traffic, excess traffic that they couldn't handle with their system, could be rerouted through Mexico and back into Toronto at really no extra cost. That is, it has to do with satellite technology and all this sort of stuff. What that means, of course, is by implication, there's no need to have a big operator-based AT&T unit, in upstate New York like they have, or in Michigan and so forth. All of this could be done somewhere else, possibly Mexico, possibly not. And the language thing is not a difficulty in this because they've developed a technology for a lot of these kinds of calls, which is called voice recognition, which can recognize any language. So there's no problem, no human beings required, nothing there. Just a lateral move, again, of a certain kind of work that used to be performed by human beings. So these kind of things, service things, can be impacted in various ways. There's another side to this whole thing of shifting investment, and that is what happens to the companies that remain in the old site, paying the higher wages and the higher costs of all kinds. Well, one thing they do is create what is now being called a contingent workforce. That is, they don't want to have these people who are making $10 or $15 an hour, so they go to a temp agency, and they hire some temporary workers, and then when they don't need them, they're gone. It's not a layoff, it's just gone, right? And there's an interesting quote from the owner of a national temporary agency who said, you know, we used to be in the business of replacing workers. He said, now our business is different. It's a major cost-cutting tool for American corporations. That's a big change. An industry that used to employ a couple 100,000 in the 70s now employs over 1.6 million people. And of course there's part-time work and all the rest of that. Finally, in terms of this projection, we're talking now about the future. This same U of Mass study says that if you look at the impact on such investment shifts on wages and on incomes in general, their estimate is that in terms of the U.S., you can expect a downward movement of 1.2 to 4.2% over this period of 1992 to the year 2000, over an 8-year period. And that figure is in addition to whatever inflation or regular unemployment does to wages in that period. I would also point out that the industries that are being most affected by some of these shifts in investment are the most unionized. And they exist very heavily in the 15 states that have above average unionization rates in manufacturing, which means that as these jobs disappear, the unionization rate in this society as a whole will go even farther down than it is now, which is very low indeed. And the ability of unions to bargain wage increases will go down. So we will see income falling everywhere. By the way, I forgot to mention that in Mexico, the income consequence of all that I was talking about was a drop in the average wage of 67% from 1982 to 1991, and a drop of 48% for the wages of industrial workers who are unionized in general and more able to resist some of this in Mexico. All right. Now there's a certain geographic specificity to all the stuff that's been going on that's important to understand if we want to see how it is going to affect the United States and how it's going to affect Mexico and to some extent how it will affect Canada, although I'm not going to go into detail on Canada. University of California economist Raul Fernandez did a book on the whole U.S.-Mexico border industrialization phenomena and drew this conclusion, about the past 10 years or so. He said, the center of gravity of manufacturing has shifted from the capital city, Mexico City, and Monterrey, to the Mexican-American border area. And indeed, that's what's happened. There has been, remember these million jobs that are estimated that were lost in Mexico? They weren't lost randomly all over the country. They were lost in the sites of traditional production in central Mexico, not just in the capital city, but in a cluster of cities that exist in and around central Mexico. So there has been a kind of hollowing out in the center of Mexico and a process of industrialization in the north of Mexico. So this thing not only impacts the United States, it also impacts part of Mexico itself, and a very important part of it. I could go into more detail, specifically in terms of the automobile industry, but I'm running a little late, so I'm not going to do that right now. What should be understood, though, about these new plants that are being built in Mexico is that if you have this image of a maquiladora plant as some cinder block garment sweatshop, you can forget it. That's maybe what it was 10 years ago, but they're not like that anymore. These are state-of-the-art, high-tech plants moving up the ladder of technology pretty steadily and quite capable and able of training workers down there to work at levels of efficiency that match those in the United States, surpass those in Europe, and are about equal to those of the low-wage countries in Asia as well, places like Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth, which would be alternative sites if it wasn't for the just-in-time phenomena here and the need for some kind of geographic proximity. All right. Decline, then, is going to occur in a number of places. We can see it in the U.S.-Canada Rust Belt, the upper Midwest, on into Ontario, and the northeast of the United States. That's been going on for quite a while. It isn't only about this phenomena, but this phenomena is a large part of it. Something that is newer, the deindustrialization of the industrial Upper South Sun Belt. That is, in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of American corporations opened branch plants in the Upper South, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and so forth. These plants are now beginning to move south of the border to Mexico. And in the southwest of the United States, where a number of industries, electronics and garment, developed in the 60s and 70s and so forth, these industries too are shifting at first gradually and now at an accelerated rate into northern Mexico. And as I mentioned before, jobs are being lost in central Mexico. So the industrial map, if you were to take an industrial map, I actually did this in my little Harvard graphic things, but I don't have any way of showing it to you, and draw employment concentrations in manufacturing in 1970, and then do it again in all three countries, and then draw the same map again in late 80s, for the most recent figures I could get that were comprehensive, you would see that this map is totally different. The industrial map of North America has already been redesigned and changed. More is yet to come. Now, there's this question of, in development theory, this question of linkages, economic linkages. You know, in the old days, if Ford set up a plant in Dearborn, Michigan, then, 2,700 supplier plants would spring up in Dearborn, Michigan, or somewhere more or less near the Detroit area. The linkages in the new system, the internationalized lean production system, are different. Because they're not linked to any specific geographic area, they do have geographic impact, but they don't necessarily develop any linkages, for example, northern Mexico. All the plants that are in northern Mexico under the Maquila program, and most of the new ones that are not Maquila plants, including 6 big high-tech, high-production auto plants in northern Mexico, are linked to the American economy. They're basically linked to the automobile industry of the Midwest. Other Maquila plants are linked, for example, those in Tijuana, in the garment and electronics, are linked to California garment and electronics manufacturers and so forth. There's no backward linkage in Mexico. You don't get genuine development in the old sense of the word. You get something different. And I could go through the specific geographic areas, but there's a United Nations study that refers to this whole phenomena as a regional core strategy, and that's basically, when you think about these economic blocks, that's what I was mentioning before. If you have this internationalized system of lean production, its core is going to be in the major, advanced, most developed country, the wealthiest country, and the other things strung out across borders. This creates very kinds of specific linkages through corporations as well. That is, whereas we used to think of economic linkages as something that would occur, like I say, in one geographic area or something, now these linkages occur through this intra-firm trade I was talking about before. They are controlled and managed by the multinational corporations that dominate this entire process. So the UN study shows that, for example, in some of the central industries in this process, intra-firm trade accounts for an enormous amount of the total trade between the United States and Mexico. In the production of cars and engines, it's 99%, hardly any leakage at all there. In other industries like electrical and electronic equipment, pharmaceuticals, tires, and rubber, it's 81% or more, according to the UN. Now, in some other industries, if you look at it, it's deceptively low. If you look at garment, or if you look at auto parts, for auto parts it's 21, they actually didn't have a figure on garment. The reason it's deceptively low is that it's true this is not intra-firm trade, because in the garment industry or the auto parts industry, you're talking about thousands of tiny competing companies. But these companies are linked to the same large multinational corporations through subcontracting arrangements. So that the trade that's taking place is trade that is under the terms of the large multinationals and not those of the competitive firms. All right, I want to give 3 examples in the United States of how this impact looks at the local level. First is El Paso, Texas. The garment industry there, in 1975, El Paso was a town that had, I think, about 6, maybe 8 very huge garment plants that belonged to companies like Levi and Lee and Farah and so forth. These plants employed 2,000 to 3,000 people in each one. They were unionized. They paid $10 to $15 an hour back then. Then when the garment industry began to open up under the border industrialization program across the Rio Grande in Ciudad Juarez, this kind of operation was no longer competitive. So what these companies did was basically they broke up their operations. They closed the big plants and they outsourced or subcontracted the work to dozens, scores of tiny sweatshops. And the industry today in El Paso is completely different than it was 10 or 15